Master Chief is an insurance nightmare. 5 minutes into a new place and he either would have destroyed it or found out how to. And these are not the only explosive revelations in Halo Infinite. Today we are checking out the features delivered with the updated engine, how infinite the settings really are on PC, and how they compare to the console's best in the Tower of Power Series X. Let's finish this fight. Game engines come and go, and although this latest title comes with a rebrand to the Slipspace engine, this is still largely the previous engine inherited from Bungie based on some key elements covered here. The lack of per-object motion blur in terms of that radial blur itself being very thin, and the movement on explosions, low precision errors on geometry in UV maps causing wobble and movement, half-rate animation cycles, aggressive shadow map pulling close to the frustum, cascaded shadow maps again very close, and other areas, all of which remain on the PC release, largely even at the highest settings. Now, this is not to say it has not been improved, which it clearly has, only this is an update rather than a new beginning from the previous engine. With a shift to an open world and single map design on this one Zeta ring, the biggest update on a visual perspective is the shift to a time of day, which does enable outdoor sections to shift over time. Cloud cover with its volumetric cloud system also adds to the grander feel the game has, complete with shadow casting across the map. These do present some of the best looking moments in the title, with that soft sun setting in the horizon giving volumetric clouds up a crepuscular rays beaming through trees, that soft shift burnt orange colours, and the contrast movement from light to dark does work well. But what lets the game down beyond these points are the material systems. They have improved slightly over previous releases, but not significantly. Using a basic metallic range for specular, you see the best in the interior reflective floors and walls that have a level of stochastic roughness to them, best appreciated with the game's SSR and torchlight illuminating anything with an angle of incidence. These are mixed with cube maps to deliver a genuine old school Halo vibe with a sharp and crisp image on both the Series X and PC, so long as you have the hardware.
Whoa, easy there, big guy. You're not...
Status report.
Status report? What? There's something you need to see, Chief.
But the engine itself does scale incredibly well. Here are a quick example side by side between the Series X and obviously the oldest you can get in the Xbox One. The visuals, the quality, and the overall impact of the title is still there. Yes, it's 30 FPS, yes, it's 720p very often, and there's other sacrifices made in the title, but you still get the same experience, the dynamic time of day, and overall, it does show the title is still based on old hardware, and therefore it's just been improved and enhanced as much as possible on the newer Series X and PC. Some of this is borne out by the slow and broken up loading time throughout the title, which doesn't really take advantage of any of the velocity architecture within inside the Series X, and certainly it doesn't really push hard in terms of loading and memory management, but that's something I'll get to in performance. Outside though, the range and quality of materials is not as striking as interiors. Rocks and mud can react very similarly and lack variety in shadows. The game does use screen space shadows in AO, but these really only show up on textured leaves or grass clumps, with rocks often just making do with the base albedo colour and surface elements and any shadow maps that may land on them. The basalt-like columns can look very metallic at times, which does add some level of high bloom, but after a short time much of the exterior locations blend into each other and, like the interiors, can become repetitive. The vertex lighting can exacerbate some of these issues, with light bleed on certain areas completely out of line and mismatched with the light sources in the sky or even point lights, and even mismatched to the texture light sources where they're placed against the point lights, creating red lights or blue lights when there shouldn't be any source at all. So comparing the Series X to PC's best, it almost exactly lines up with high. Low and medium improve the distance of LOD objects, shadow casting objects, you can see here from this long distance. And once you get to high, those containers cast the shadow. But you compare that to ultra, there's only a subtle difference right off into the background with some better distant AO. Quality lines up almost exactly with high, but you can't really tell the difference between high and ultra, and the impact on performance is not massive, around 10 to 15% at certain points. What you can see is the difference in performance mode on the Series X, which kicks in VRS, which means that objects, textures all look very dithered and blocky, and it stands out a mile when you do that. When you're comparing high to quality and high to ultra, I would argue most people wouldn't notice the difference, and that's the same in gameplay. But that VRS, as you can see here, really makes objects look very blocky and very dithered, and then they shimmer around quite heavily, and it isn't an option that I would recommend on a campaign at all. 120 FPS it may add, but it really isn't as perfect as you would hope, and I'll cover that in performance. Cinematics do play a big part, and they often ramp up the point and directional lights, adding soft feathered shadows, bokeh sample depth of field, higher animation rig models, and a stronger personal camera system. These are, much like 5, the best looking sections of the title, and they help drive the narrative of the campaign, vital in Halo titles. Often these are also seamlessly blended into and out of gameplay, which is a welcome boost. It's not always the case with some pre-rendered videos or even mixtures of fade to black, but when they are merged, it's most welcome and helps bridge the game between the cutscenes in gameplay better than previous entries. They also target 60 FPS unlike 5 did at launch, but more on that when we get to performance. What these do show us though is the texture quality can be inconsistent. Some objects in the game world or characters, such as the jackal snipers or grunts, have decent level materials, high res textures and skin, even if they look a bit plasticky and slightly older than the current generation high points. But others, such as main new enemies, can still look like they're using low resolution and minimal composite design, all centered on the base Xbox One, which is not a surprise as the game was designed for that. And therefore the quality on the Series X and PC offers is better, but it's not a drastic shift over the worst you see on the Xbox One or even lower end PCs. Throughout play you will likely see this mixed level of quality, with it not ruining the game at all, merely reducing the visual fidelity on such a high profile title at certain points. The high points are often the moody lit interior sections, true to the Halo legacy, rather than the open but repetitive landscape.
It's close enough.
It better be. I'm getting out of here.
So the final piece of the puzzle is performance. So here an RTX 2070 and a Zen 2700X targeting the Series X settings, which is high across everything aside from ultra on the textures. You end up with a game that dynamically scales heavier and dips more often. Now to set the dynamic scaler up, you just set it in the menu at the lowest and highest bands to the same. So 60/60 means it will scale to keep that target. If you set the lower bands to off, which means it won't scale at all, and it will run at whatever resolution you've set in the menu. Now the Series X does also scale down to 1440p approximately and up to 4K. Here on the RTX 2070 it predominantly is around 1080p in heavy combat. It can be slightly higher, can even be slightly lower in heavier sections, but it rarely is at 4K. But like I say, it can get somewhere close to 50 and 60 FPS on average in firefights, slightly lower than that at certain heavier points. But as you can see here, traversing the landscape and travelling around, you then start putting much more pressure on the internal systems, so the memory subsystems, the dual pools of RAM in terms of the GPU and the system RAM, and then the CPU allocation. It can max out this particular CPU, and certainly the RX 3600 on every single core, and that means you can get lows of 30 FPS on this particular machine. It can cause stalling occasionally on the GPU, heavy overload on the CPU, and that's because it's a very old engine being forced to try and create this open world area, which means it's probably using sector points to instantiate things into RAM and then remove things as it goes through and keep that pool of RAM close to the limits. You can see this here with the allocation of RAM always being at 8 gigabytes, and actually it goes up to 14 to 15 gigabytes on the RX 6800. Comparing it to the Series X, certainly the Series X can dip in cutscenes. It tends to scale less aggressively, and obviously that half frame rate animation in terms of the characters themselves means at certain points the screen doesn't update because nobody's actually moving at a basically half rate, which would be 30 FPS. But in combat, it does a much better job. It scales less aggressively than the RTX 2070, and it holds 60 FPS pretty much all the time. There are single frame drops here and there, but not enough that you'd notice it in combat and playing the game. It's far too minimal, only one skip into the next refresh cycle of 33 milliseconds. But again, it can traverse the landscape much better, and the reason for this is twofold. One, the CPU is far more efficient in terms of being a games console. It's got less overhead, it does a better job at being a games console. That's totally what it's designed to do. And secondly, the API construction is designed around a specific piece of hardware, therefore the driver overhead cost is much less, as is the pressure on the RAM. Series X doesn't have to contend with this, consoles don't, so therefore memory is far more often in place, and that means there's less load on the CPU to be moving this data back and forth, instantiating things into existence all the time, and copying and creating dual pools. All of that is completely removed on the consoles, and therefore you get better performance. Now, there is optimization work to do on the PC. They need to improve this and obviously bring this more in line with other PC titles, but a lot of this will be legacy constraints of the engine being made to push an open world area like this, which means there'll be a lot of memory juggling at all times. You can see this on the PC version, as I get to in a minute, in the RX 6800. The 120 FPS mode is great that it's there as an option. It's really a multiplayer option in my opinion. The impact of visuals are far too high, and the performance cost here, as you can see, it's generally somewhere between 90 and 100 FPS in combat, and then when you're traversing the landscape, that cost that I've just mentioned is much higher because you're trying to do all of this in 8 milliseconds rather than 16, and therefore you can drop down to, you know, the high 70s at certain points in this video section, and even you can get it lower than that at other sections. So overall, it's still a great performing title, but the fluctuation levels of the 120 FPS mode for me are far too big. The visual impact is too high, the resolution level gets quite aggressive at this point, the VRS makes everything look quite blocky and blurry when you're looking at anything, and the performance doesn't really stack up to the cost. You can end up seesawing up and down anywhere between 80 FPS and 120, and that is just far too big a delta to feel smooth as you play. Overall, it's great that it's there and it's a great option for multiplayer, but it isn't one that I would turn on. And this is true even if you're interiors as well. Fighting indoors with other combat sections, you know, bread and butter Halo stuff, it really doesn't feel any better, and it can still drop heavily.
You need to get out of here.
I'm working on it.
Work faster. These pelicans nearly on board and the power's still out. Don't let them get me.
Then the final one is the big boy of the party, the RX 6800 paired with the Ryzen 3600. Again, less cores, but generally a more powerful CPU in terms of IPC throughput. Again, in combat here at ultra settings, 4K dynamic scaling turned on. Even with it turned off, you're hovering somewhere between 45 and 60. You need it turned on even on this machine. It does do an exceptional job. Battling, fighting, it's almost identical to the performance levels we're seeing on the Series X. It scales enough, it's got enough GPU headroom to keep that performance levels as needed. But traversing the landscape, again, it can still have heavier dips. You know, at some points here, dropping down to mid-50s, much better than what we've just seen with the RTX 2070, and that's the combination of more GPU power and slightly better IPC of that CPU. But even then, when you go out into the open landscape and travel for long periods of time, as you'll see in a moment, you can still swamp out the entire CPU 100% on every single core, pretty much maxed out, and that means you can get down to the low 40s for very brief points, and that just feels bad to play. And unsurprisingly, in addition to this, the PC does have some specific issues in terms of playing it, certainly on the Game Pass version that I tested here. I had a few issues downloading it and patching the version, which turned out to be a Windows-related issue, so you have to make sure you've got the latest version of Windows, otherwise the Game Pass version itself either doesn't download, or when it does, it won't let you launch the title. I had quite a few crashes in the game, completely locking up, and me having to quit the title and go back. I even managed to launch the game twice, and have two XEs running at the same time, which was just waiting for one to load. So there are definitely specific issues they need to iron out on PC that aren't present on consoles, or at least they're not as prevalent on consoles. But it is still an enjoyable and one of the better Halo titles. In fact, I'd say it's the best to play Halo title from 343 Industries by far, and it's got an absolutely incredible soundtrack, really embracing the love and passion for Martin O'Donnell's original soundtrack, but ramping it up and having some great scores throughout the game that really ramp up the atmosphere. And again, there's points in the title where I stopped playing just to listen to the music in the background. It is an exceptional audio treat, much better in my opinion than the visual one. It's not a bad looking game, it just isn't a great looking one. Anyway, that's it for another deep dive into PC and console analysis. But if you do like what we do here on IGN Games, and obviously these performance reviews, then keep it IGN and click subscribe down below, and I'll catch you on the next one.
And you have little time remaining in it.